question on psychedelics, whether it would be from somebody that's new to the experiences or somebody with some familiarity. I think that there's too much that gets lost in translation unless you can try to use some form of analogy or maybe comparison, a way that you can relate these unrelatable ideas to people. And a common question that I get when people are asking me about DMT, or when they hear me talk about the experience of DMT and they're familiar with other psychedelics, maybe even high doses of those psychedelics, it is very difficult to explain to somebody that both experiences can be so intense that it's impossible to put context on or to explain with human language. Human language seems to fail at this point. And then I make a statement such as, it is inexplainable how strong magic mushrooms are. And then the follow-up question would be, well, then how can you tell me that DMT is the most profound and strong experience you've ever had? Well, I think that the analogy that I'm going to be using to kind of discuss this is, think of a coin. And this coin in this analogy is you. And we're going to just look at two different sides of us and who we are as people. And if we were to be very basic and kind of ignore a lot of philosophy and views that people might have on this, and just agree that we have an external world and an internal world, and the relationship between the two is complicated, it's complex, it's often what drives us to these substances. Now, what you get from each substance seems to me to share so many common traits, but there are also very unique things about magic mushrooms or 4-HO-DMT versus NMDMT or dimethyltryptamine. And what are these differences? They're not as prevalent in the lower doses, and I think trying to explain any of this with language is unfortunately going to diminish what I'm actually getting to here. But the best comparison I could give for you is, if you were to focus on one of these two experiences, and I'm going to start with mushrooms being the one that more people are familiar with, and you were to think of how the experience feels when you have 1 gram versus 2.5 grams, or maybe versus 3 grams. These experiences seem to have such dramatically differing effects, and the severity in which they seem to increase is overwhelming. And to explain this to somebody that has just ingested 5 grams of mushrooms, that there's something beyond that, doesn't make sense. And I would like to try and do my best to explain why this cognitive fallacy happens, why we struggle with language and comparing psychedelics, by talking about dose of magic mushrooms. So I'm going to use two imaginary people, Joe and Trevor. Joe takes 5 grams of mushrooms, and he has an experience that is completely indescribable. It is past anything he's experienced in his life up until this point, and he has no way to put contextual information to it. Where does this fit into my worldview? And then you have the guy beside Joe, who has taken a variety of these dosages, maybe not even approaching 5 grams. The problem happens when these two people try to both explain their experience, because they will both use the same terminology. They will both realize that their experience is so impossible to explain. How do we begin to compare two people's experiences with these substances? We can't. As you increase the dosage, people often ask me on high dose mushroom trips, what happens? And well, I guess it's something that I don't necessarily encourage everybody to go out and try. But as somebody who has taken what would be viewed to some as reckless doses in the upwards of 20 to 30 grams of dried mushrooms in a setting where I was monitored both medically and by people around me who are very familiar with the substance and what to expect. And of course, there was a lot of preparation to go into an experience like this. And then I I take that and I reflect on it and I try to put this somewhere in this lineup of experiences and say this was more extreme than that. And I think that this is where the problem comes from. What I found is that in low doses of psychedelics, the effects and differences are noticeable, but they aren't to the point where the experience in itself is giving you a different impression or a different meaning. When I took the high dose mushroom trips, the deeper and deeper I would go, and when I say deeper, I mean it's almost like there is no end to it. I don't think that there's a point that you can reach that's like, okay, I've fully saturated myself with this molecule. There just is your experience you have, and it can be more and more and more intense. And there's never seems to be a point where you can arrive and say, I've made it, this is as far as I can go. But let's talk about what direction these experiences head. And I find mushrooms are much more like a microscope. They show me some very beautiful and interesting things about my relationship with the world around me. But what the message and the meaning I seem to be overwhelmed with is personal context. It's the events in my life and how they've made me feel and how they've shaped me, preconceived notions I might have, cognitive fallacies that I've held on to, things that I can't let go of. It seems to want to keep bringing me back into this self analyzation. I guess analyzing the deepest core parts of who you are as a person. And on these high dose trips, that seems to just become so prevalent that it's almost as if the experience is about really realizing the enormity of who you are and how enormously complex and beautiful the human body, the human spirit, the human experiences. And then we're going to take this conversation and then turn to DMT. Now, I was posed this question recently by a friend, and he said, how can you tell me this? And then also, in the same discussion, tell me that DMT was the strongest experience you've had in your life. Well, the strength can't be compared because we're talking about completely different things. We're trying to, in an English language, explain non-Englishable concepts. And so all we can do is use analogies. So my analogy today is going to be a coin. If on one side of this coin was the entirety of all the experiences you could have on mushrooms, and on the other side of this coin was the entirety of all the experiences you could have on DMT, I see so many similarities between a decently strong DMT trip and, 5, 6, 7 grams of mushrooms. I see the connection that people make. But once you really, really push these substances, you realize that there's actually a very, very different thing that is being given to you in return. the lessons and the focal points and the things that either whether you view it as your mind or whether you view it in a more spiritual way, the point of this is not to get into how you take these experiences. It's more to give you context in how to compare them. So you're having this experience on DMT, and all of a sudden you're telling yourself, this is so profound. This is the most incredible thing that I've ever been through. But the lessons that are being thrown at you are not the same ones that I seem to get from mushrooms. They're both teachers in a sense. They both seem to just be desperate to show me things. And when I say show me things, I'm talking in a language as if these mushrooms are a foreign entity. Really, if I were to make any claims that I were to understand these experiences to their fullest, I would be lying to you. The truth is what I'm trying to say is that if you were to think of these things as teachers, as people, as guiders, they seem to want to take you towards different lessons, to show you different things. And this is what I experienced on mushrooms on 28 grams, which is a dried ounce for any of you that might not be familiar with grams. The experience lasted probably about 16 hours. It was overwhelmingly long and it was incredibly exhausting. But I could not get over how much more respect and understanding I seem to have gained for the beauty of who am I? What am I? And all of a sudden, I was able to let go of all of these things I was holding on to. And this was before I'd ever experienced DMT. Now, DMT is a little bit different because, yeah, you can get these same lessons from it, but on these high breakthrough doses of DMT, it seems like what it's trying to show, or at least what it shows me, is the same thing from a different perspective. It's showing me the other side of that coin, the other side of myself. It's not the microscope as much as it's the telescope that I have to understand my relation to the world around me. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean that when you enter this DMT experience and you've already experienced these states on mushrooms and you have your preconceived notions about, how big and grandiose the human mind and soul and body and spirit are, and then all of a sudden you flip that coin. DMT, it was the most humbling experience I had because it almost immediately shows you that and then says, huh, but look over here. Let's make you the smallest part of this experience in a sense and show you the vastness that exists beyond you, within you, around you. It's this overwhelming sensation that you are viewing some core nature of reality. And both lessons seem to want the same thing, at least when I say want, I guess what I mean is they both seem to be pushing you in the same direction of self-realization. But the high dose mushroom trip took me into my mind and made me ask questions about myself and see how beautiful it is, this experience we have of being alive, and how complex I am, and how much more value there is to me than I ever gave myself. DMT then took that and pulled that rug from out under my feet, and it said, here, let me show you that not only is that true, but outside of you exists something just as beautiful and just as infinite and just as complex. So, why are the similarities important? I think it's because the language between these two experiences is broken down as soon as we forget that you are the coin. Both sides of these coins, heads, tails, mushrooms, DMT, it's the wrong way to be thinking about these experiences sometimes. The best way to really look at it is you are the coin. And whether you're looking inwards or outwards, the lessons that you receive from these molecules, they're not always guaranteed. They're not as black and white as even I'm trying to make it sound right now. But yet, there is something that is fundamentally different about both of these. I don't prefer one over the other. Some people really do. I have more fear, I would say, towards DMT because of its initial overwhelming feeling of, I guess, being launched into this experience. And even on ayahuasca, which for those of you who might not be familiar, is when you combine NN-DMT, which is normally smoked or vaporized in the Western culture, and then you are to combine it with a myo inhibitor. All of a sudden, the enzyme that normally would make DMT orally inactive makes it active. And it allows this 5 to 15-minute experience to be stretched out over hours and hours and hours. And it really gives you a chance to explore the state a bit more. And for that reason, it is much more intense than anything else I've ever done myself. And every time I've gone to do it, my heart pounds. I'm nervous. I'm sweating. Even as I start the experience, I'm terrified. But then I get there, and the terror goes away. It melts. But with mushrooms, the terror doesn't seem the same to me because I feel like I am more prepared for what mushrooms is going to show me. I am more, maybe it's just a simple matter that I've used it more. I've used mushrooms more than I've used DMT in my life. But when the core question is posed to me, what is the difference between these two drugs and which is stronger? You have to understand that that can't be answered. Yes, most people will agree DMT is stronger than mushrooms. No, I don't think that mushrooms